give you a
randomly,
sense
yeah.
of.
Sure.
Okay, so let's see where to start. I think that the overarching task is to help the city develop an implementation strategy for the urban forest management plan. Again, as you're probably all aware, in 2007, there was a big process to create an urban forest management plan that helped to look at what the resource of the urban forest was in the city, and come up with ways, kind of start a really broad course for how we wanted to increase canopy cover towards specific goals. And we've taken a lot of steps over the course of the time that we'll talk about in the next kind of retreat. But at this point, I think we were thinking that we really need a kind of implementation plan to take those broad goals and start narrowing them down into kind of specific tasks, and also kind of an agenda for what are the issues that we're going to take on over time. So I think one, that broad implementation plan that's going to balance out all the different ways we have that are more city spending versus more public outreach versus more regulation, trying to figure out how we balance all those things together. Within that, there's going to be a lot of specific tasks. One, updating our regulations, our private property regulations, the tree protection code. Updating our street tree regulations and the kind of street tree code that we have. There's going to be a lot of specific issues about how we manage, especially like the right-of-way, to balance power lines and trees and infrastructure investment. View protections, how we balance private views and public property and private property, and how those things interact. Let's see some other ones. I think there's even a lot of the other big one will be how we develop an outreach program, how we want to communicate with the public from everything from what's their responsibilities, rights and responsibilities are, what the regulatory requirements are to how to plant a tree and what they want to do if they want to plant street trees. And I think also what are the kind of slate of incentives that we want to provide to encourage tree planting. And again, building off of what we currently have to the Department of Neighborhood's tree planting, utility rate incentives, to kind of look more broadly at how those all work together with our programs. There's a lot of other very small, specific things that will probably come up, as like tree planting lists and things like that will also release before the committee.
In February, there was an audit by the Seattle Auditor's office, and that report details that 9 different departments that have the authority to condemn a tree don't deal effectively with each other, and they don't deal with the public. So I hope that you would add the recommendations of the auditor to part of your work plan. And as far as the 5-year implementation plan for the urban forestry management plan, I would suggest that you put the magnifying glass on that and reduce it down to 1 year, because the City Council has declined to adopt the urban forest management plan. It's a staff-only plan, and it was developed in secret.
So maybe the remainder of this discussion might be useful just to hear what community members, if there's other things that are kind of broad things that people are interested in.
Can I just say one thing? I guess we want to make sure that the auditor's report is part of the discussion at the retreat. That'd be nice. It probably is, but just make sure it's part of
Yeah,
that.
it is.
Okay. And then secondly, I was hoping that there'd be time at the retreat to maybe do some of this brainstorming around what the topics are that we additionally might want to address, or what's missing, because I feel like, I got appointed to this commission, there's a lot of issues coming at us. The city knows what they want to do, and it's written down, so we have a course. But as we all come with all our personal, whatever influences, I think it might be nice to do a quick brainstorm of what the issues are from our perspectives, and then maybe do some prioritizing or whatever that will help us get to a point. So have some of the retreat carved out where we can do a little bit of brainstorming. I would request that.
And if by chance that isn't carved out, because if we're going on a tour or something, that I would recommend that we do that at our following meeting. I think that's really important. There's just all sorts of issues that this encompasses.
Mike brought up an interesting point that's been important to me for a long time, and that's that the city figure out how to speak with one voice about tree management. I mean, it's really all over the map. I mean, to make a long story short, what we really need is a Bureau of Forestry that has status right up there with Seattle City Light and SPU, and so that management of trees is as important as picking up garbage and providing water and getting the sewage treated. And the biggest probably example of this is the school district over here wanting to cut down a whole lot of trees at Ingram High School. And the mayor over here is saying, we need to plant, X number of hundreds of thousands of more trees. And there's just such an obvious disconnect just in that one example. That is I think, a very compelling issue for this commission from the very beginning.
I agree. It seems like there's a lot of city departments who have jurisdiction over trees in a lot of different circumstances, none of whom recognize that as their primary function. The trees are something that they have or manage or in a way or whatever, but it's not their primary function. So I think that figuring out how that voice can come together would be great. I also think that something we might want to have on our list is the development of partnerships. Private partnerships, partnerships with NGOs, partnerships with other city programs, to get things apparent. That's a very broad statement, but thinking of all the different groups that work in the city in this area, that would be nice to have some place to include people in.
As part of a tour, whoever's organizing that, is something like that going to be provided to give everybody kind of a picture of what the organizational, institutional landscape looks like in terms of the city, as well as, I mean, there are lots of these partnerships of a variety of kinds, friends of and NGOs and everybody else. So we're going to try and kind of draw that map. So
Yes, that would be
that would be useful.
It might be a brainstorming item, but within the pedestrian master plan, because it became an item of discussion, there is a paper, and so it's on the website about trees and sidewalks, and so it is something sort of a background report as far as the right-of-way area, and that was worked with the urban forestry and pedestrian and DPU. But again, the resolution, it's a to-do task.
Last May, the Washington State Legislature appointed a urban forestry task force with the job of preparing a manual for tree commissions. And then the budget cut hit, and that manual was deferred. However, this Blue Ribbon State Urban Forestry Board did have a list of recommendations that weren't in the final format of a manual. So I would suggest that if this group develops a tree management plan, that you do it in the same format as all of the other communities in the state. And that was that group's recommendation, is with a couple hundred incorporated municipalities, if they're in different formats, they can't be cross-referenced. So you guys should take off your blinders and blow up your view to include the state as well in what you do.
I would also ask, like, all the expertise in the room, if we can start maybe developing a bibliography. If you have reports that you know where people have really good articles, maybe have a place where we can mark them. So I certainly know that I can learn a lot more from everyone else, so key reports or something like that.
I've noticed, Mark and Brennan are here representing DPD and Parks, but in my mind, SDOT and City Light are somewhat absent from this room, and I don't know how are we have to compel their participation, but.
I suspect that they will be regular
Okay.
contributors. I mean, like, certainly with the urban forest IDT that we have there at every meeting and part of every discussion, I think it's really just a matter of this is a very technical
They didn't want to hear about our
bylaws.
bylaws, yeah, but that's fine, I just.
City Light has an actual forester now.
Yeah, no, I know, I've talked to Mark about this,
Yeah.
the overall need to think of one mind, whether it's a bureau, but whatever you call it, you can't work maybe from some smaller landowners like school districts, I don't know.
I think that was one of the things that we asked ourselves in regards to this commission is how much do you want us here to provide information, in the sense that, you know, there's the counterpoints of influencing and providing information, being a fly on the wall and just being there for, and we kind of view ourselves as technical experts that we could draw upon, and that as the subject matters come up, we'll be here to provide that information, but we're definitely not part of the decision making, and definitely not regular participators in the decision making process. But definitely, and we leave that to the commission to make that decision, you know, what you want from us in terms of participation. On a professional level, I believe that we should be here to provide whatever information you need at whatever time you need to.
Well, and I think it's going to be very important, and I believe in stakeholder buy-in, I believe in integrative processes, you know, through delivering something that people actually can be able to implement. I don't think we can do it without you guys present.
So I guess we should review collectively the agenda for the following meeting, so we know what kind of expertise we need on that meeting, make sure that those people are at the meeting, they can schedule it, be there.
Can the minutes and agendas of the Urban Forest Coalition be made public?
That is, no, then the bylaws, yes. They will all be on posted on the website.
The Urban Forest Coalition?
Oh,
You're talking about the interdepartmental team. That's a kind of a separate issue for another time, but yeah, we can talk about that.
But if we ask for the minutes and agenda for the Urban Forest Coalition and we were told that they don't exist, then now you've changed the name of it to Interdepartmental Team for Forestry. Can we get those minutes too, please?
We can talk about that later.
I think this group would be educated if they read about what occurred in a staff meeting. You got 9 different departments that attend this tree meeting every month. What happened at that meeting, please?
So do people actually want to know about this issue? So we as a city meet regularly to work out issues. We don't, like all city meetings, we don't keep minutes. And we don't really have, obviously no staff that are prepared to keep minutes on things. So it's a kind of a side issue that I guess is going to be going on.
This is a side issue of a $3 million budget.
Is that the urban, what is that coalition or?
So it's not a coalition. So we changed the name because there's confusion about what coalition means. It's just so all the different departments that manage trees, which almost every department meets regularly to kind of handle issues as they come up.
And you meet this is a group to meet specifically on issues regarding trees, so it's kind of, would you characterize it as reactionary to current issues, or as a planning and
I would say it encompasses all things that, and whenever there's individual issues that come up, whenever there's
Semi-regularly scheduled, and basically it's not reactionary in that sense, but it's kind of the body that created the Urban Forest Management Plan, and it's more about making sure that we do have a communication across the different departments. It does not work as a body to produce work that it goes unseen. Basically, it's things like your forest
coordinating
management
function,
plan.
isn't it?
Pardon me?
Coordinating functions.
Correct.
Yeah.
What kind of issues come up, Mark, for instance?
The majority of our body of our work has to do with the urban forest management plan. Just how what our work plans are for the next year. And those work plans are basically what we do is we bring to the table is what our work plans are for our department. And we match those up with the goals of the urban forest management plan. And those discussions occur in each department. And then, as an example, we look at stuff down to the nitty-gritty of presentations that each of us are going to be giving at different public meetings. So it's interdepartmental coordination, basically.
I think that would be the kind of thing, again, when you're sort of talking about what the landscape looks like out there. I think, John's comment is a good one. I mean, there's a perception on many people's part maybe that there isn't coordination, but the fact is that there is this group that gets together on a regular basis to try and address many of these position is to the extent that this group understands all of these things that are going on, we're in a better position to kind of recommend maybe what things might happen, where there may be deficiencies and that sort of thing. You know, assume maybe that was going to be part of the conversation too in January. Just how the agencies coordinate within the city.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good.
And these are all City of Seattle agencies exclusively, which would exclude someone like the Seattle Public Schools, or the University of Washington for that matter, or the locks.
Well, okay.
Is that right? Correct.
Yeah.
Except that there are interdepartmental and agency teams that go beyond the department. So that could be a recommendation that we talk about, is that if there's an IDT, that it be an IDAT, interdepartmental agency team. But that's a common good thing that the city does, is to have those people meet. And they're formal in that it's consistent, but informal in that it brings them together to talk in a kind of an open network framework. So generally, I found those to be good. I think the idea of expanding it to some of the other ones might be helpful, but, and they generally don't, they're not formal, so they don't generally do minutes. And I think it's hard for sometimes the public to understand the difference between, whereas our group would, now, it's good that they have this. I think that may be the reason this group is here, because there has to be a place where the public can hear about issues, comment on issues, and get some traction.
So there may be value in having a liaison like Mark presenting monthly updates or as necessary. I would think
That's a good idea.
fairly brief,
Yeah.
but keeping the commission apprised of the committee's activities or the team's activities. And then
So
we're not heading off and,
But it's really, what's interesting to me is that we are a City of Seattle appointed commission, okay? And then we're gonna advise these public agencies, these public groups within the City of Seattle structure on how to manage trees perhaps. Well, what happens, the University of Washington is within the City of Seattle completely. The Ballard locks are within the City of Seattle completely, federal, state, school district, within the City of Seattle completely. Three different public entities. And now, are we going to have any influence over their tree management?
You're
May
not
I
going to.
suggest,
Those are
there are major
separate governmental
institutions.
agencies that the city of Seattle doesn't have the control over, except for where we regulate them as private property owners like any other private property.
But should the City of Seattle have some jurisdiction over how the University of Washington manages its trees? I mean, I'm being devil's advocate here. Because the classic example is Ingram High School. Did someone not talk to the superintendent of schools about the mayor's plan to preserve trees in the city of Seattle before they came up with this plan to basically clear cut a forest to expand the school? I mean, to me, it's just a glaring disconnect. I would hope that this commission can think expansively enough to try to have some influence, not just over the 9 agencies that manage trees in the city of Seattle, but urban forestry in Seattle. I just think outside the box for a minute.
Well, I think we can think outside and in the box. Looking at this list, that as we go down updating the regulations on private property and within the land use, as much as they operate a little bit, independent's the wrong word, but they have a set of guidelines that they fall under. Those institutional guidelines could be looked at, we can look at that within the development codes for private properties. They're in there, right? But they're over here, and maybe that's a place to look at, and unfortunately, that line didn't come across, hasn't been as clear in the past. And I think that's when you were talking about, you know, you're going through your items, that really is updating the regulations, that's within that, that's the venue to get in.
And when we get to that point, I think, you know, there's the residential regulations, there's the industrial, and then when you get to institutional, I think it requires a level of outreach just because they have so much land, you know, the Port of Seattle, huge landowner. There's giant hurdle liabilities out there, and, you know, there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also, you know, an economic need for water-dependent industrial use that has to be balanced in some way. Administration plan.
I think that's
so
all
I
within
think-
the land use.
Yeah,
you know,
and I
then-
just think as when we get to institutional, that's where we gotta start talking to the university, Seattle schools, Port of Seattle, and even some of the larger corporate campuses in the city that have big pieces of land.
So if I can interject, it's 4:30. I think we all, you know, there's a lot of issues and enthusiasm out there, and I think that's what we need, so that's great. You know, I will have, Tracy will be back to you, you'll be hearing from her next on some of these bylaw revisions and the scheduling for these next upcoming meetings. So
I'm doing a spell check.
I don't know if we need a motion to adjourn.
Oh, really?
I don't know.
All in favor, yes.
Yes, and if we can keep your name tags, we can reuse these. Sure.